Hello everyone, this is Poohead189, and today I am answering a question you guys are really interested in. Today we are going to be speaking about just why do dwarves in Warhammer, or Lord of the Rings, or really most settings, tend not to use polearms. Again, while I make videos on many fantasy and science fiction universes, you know I did an Elder Scrolls kick last year, but right now we're focusing on Warhammer Fantasy. But this can be interchangeable with any setting, really, because Warhammer dwarves are probably the most ideal stereotypical fantasy dwarves, and it'll be true for many settings. Anyway, let's begin. So, first we'll give the general reasons, and mention a few other universes, but as we go on, we'll get more and more into Warhammer-specific reasons. Now, historians, pop historians, and armchair internet historians all like to extol the fact polearms, throughout human history, are the most useful and widespread weapon ever. Yes, it is true that there is an ongoing debate right now pushing back against that narrative on the medieval side of the internet, but even people like myself who don't think that polearms are the end-all be-all still admit they were still extremely common in virtually every military throughout history, and were extremely effective. Polearms have reach, many can be thrown, you can fight extremely easily in a formation, they're great both in offense and defense, they don't require a lot of bronze or iron or steel to be effective, which means they are cheap and easy to produce. The only real problem with polearms is that they are generally long, and so therefore you have to carry it and cannot holster or sheath it, unless it's a particularly short one. However, it is important to note that unless we are speaking of the Shannara series or the squats from 40k, dwarves are not descended from men, and are not even related to them. This is certainly the case in Warhammer Fantasy, where they cannot even interbreed with men. Dwarfs did not begin life on the plains or in the trees, where men found plentiful wood and needed to use long spears to hunt. Dwarfs are creatures of mountains and caverns. Not only were dwarf origins beneath the world, but that was also where they learned to fight. Fighting above ground was something that came later, when chaos first entered the world. Or maybe it was perhaps when the orcs first attacked. But it was never their primary realm of peace or war. On average, fully 2/3 of every Karak, or dwarf hold, are below ground. And even the areas that are above ground are generally not permanently settled by the dwarfs that use them. Only some dwarf farmers, dwarf traders, and the famous dwarf rangers fully operate above ground for most of their careers, and they're considered extremely strange by most of their kin. This leads to a few complications when it comes to spears or other polearms. Firstly, polearms are typically long and need ample room. You can't really march dwarfs with polearms through caverns unless dwarfs have built the caverns, and that is never a guarantee, and even then they might be unwieldy. Secondly, material. Men found spears and pikes to be cheap because timber is plentiful to us. It is less so for the Dawi, or really any fantasy dwarfs save the ones in Shannara. Stone and metals are more plentiful for dwarfs, and even when dwarfs use wood for their weapons, they tend to prefer to use a special tree called Wootroth, and Wootroth is exceedingly rare these days. In fact, let me read an excerpt on Wootroth in Grudgelore. For Wootroth it says, "In latter centuries, the dwarfs have taken to making most of their goods and arms entirely from smelted steel, brass, and gold. Yet in ages past, they fashioned items from wood, like men and elves, and through careful lacquering and care, the oldest dwarf heirlooms still have wooden parts. Most of the wood lumbered from a hold's overground realm is used to make charcoal for fires, but there is one tree that the dwarfs value as much as metal. This is Wootroth, known variously as ironbark, stone trunk, or mountain oak. The Wootroth is not the tallest of trees, but its trunk and boles are exceptionally broad. It grows incredibly slowly and only at the highest altitudes. To preserve itself against the wind and cold, it has a very thick bark, which is worn smooth by constant mountain gales. Its leaves are small, and its nuts form in dense clusters that the dwarf ancestors used to employ as bullets for hunting slings. With each passing season, the Wootroth layers on ring after ring of fine new growth, leading to a very dense, heavy wood. Yet for all of its strength, this wood keeps moist for a long time and thus can be shaped like willow or ash into bows, shields, canopies, and other curved structures. The greatest Wutroth forests were destroyed along with much of the dwarf realm during the Time of Woes, and dwarf rangers are constantly on the lookout for isolated groves and small woodlands of this tree. So, as it says, Wutroth is very rare, and dwarves don't tend to use much wooden weapons these days anyway. Next, fighting underground, so we're going back to the underground part, fighting underground means there is a distinct lack of cavalry to fight against. Humans and elves utilize cavalry for and against one another. Dwarves don't bother with it at all, and so the need for lances or anti-cavalry polearms were not a priority. However, when dwarves do fight cavalry, or monsters, they are more hardy and able to weather a charge compared to men, and they have plenty of other weapons to wield against them. Crossbows, black powder weapons, artillery, the spikes atop their axes, and even axes themselves. There have been a few types of axes in our own history that have been theoretically used as anti-cavalry weapons like the Dane axe. Plus, we must understand how dwarfs are built. A dwarf is squatter and shorter than a man, though in overall mass a dwarf is typically the same size or larger than a man. A dwarf, however, has longer arms than many give them credit for, yet even with their near simian arms, their bodies are too broad to be comfortable with using the normal stance men tend to use for spears. They can, of course, still use them if need be, and there's no cultural taboo on using spears. However, for a dwarf to make a weapon that is fairly unwieldy for them, with no historical background or practical use in most of their day-to-day life, it would be quite odd. And we cannot also forget that there are various points of speculation. The spear is the favored weapon amongst all of the elves, be it high elves, wood elves, potentially it could also be said for dark elves maybe. And remember the term for elf, elgi, is synonymous for weak. It could be that the spear, as well as other polearms, are considered elvish weapons. Again, that's speculation, but we just don't know. We also need to acknowledge that no dwarf gods are known to have spears as favored weapons. And we also know dwarfs idolize their ancestors and their ancestor gods, and would not want to dishonor them by trying to use something they did not see fit to. Now, one could argue that no dwarf gods used artillery or black powder weapons either. However, Grungni is also the god of engineers, so they could be said to still be under Grungni's purview. Now, the real argument against this is that the sword is not a dwarfish weapon either, yet we do know in later editions, Gazul, the god of the dead and of killing undead and necromancers, wields a flaming sword called Zarvingrin, which means flaming vengeance in Khazalid. However, Gazul is also considered somewhat of a black sheep amongst the dwarf pantheon, at least it seems that way, and dwarfs still do craft swords when commissioned, the most famous examples being the runefangs they made to gift to the future Elector Counts of the Empire. We should also note that other fantasy universes, like Lord of the Rings, do sometimes have dwarves using swords, though it's still somewhat uncommon. Even the swords the dwarves in The Hobbit had were special weapons they only used out of necessity. However, even if dwarfs are fighting above ground, which is uncommon, and on flat ground, which is even more uncommon, and they're fighting cavalry or monsters, which is a possibility, yet again we know dwarfs have many answers to those questions. Dwarfs have impeccable armor, great artillery, great ranged weaponry, they can hold their ground so plowing into them won't do much damage, and they also have very unique weapons like the Iron Drakes with their Trollhammer torpedoes or Drak guns. There's very little reason for a dwarf with a shield to hold a relatively flimsy spear or waste Wutroth in making it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you would, liking and commenting would be immeasurably appreciated. That always helps the algorithm, and sharing always helps too. All my links are in the description below. And remember, thanks so much guys, and I will see you next time. Alright, bye-bye.